Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. We're just going to take a minute to let people join us today as everyone's logging in. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Mindfulness in Dialectical Behaviour Therapy, an introduction with Sonya Varma. She is a clinical psychology graduate student in the Treating and Understanding Life-Threatening Behavior and Posttraumatic Stress Lab at York University. And with me today, we have Alicia and Lenka with the Ashley Boca Mindfulness Foundation and myself, Trisha. For those who are not familiar with the foundation, we work to improve the quality of life for individuals impacted by motion dysregulation, as well as a broad spectrum of mental illnesses associated with BPD. We also offer support and educational services for loved ones and increase community awareness about mental health. And so just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can please type them into the Q&A chat box in the control panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll put forward as many questions as we can for Sonya to answer. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of our webinar. And if we don't get to your questions, or if you have additional questions, or you want to send us anonymous questions as well, you can email us at programs@abmf.charity, and we'll be sure to get back to you. And also, we'll be also sending a recording link and the presentation slides to you via email shortly thereafter. So I'd like to turn over to our presenter today, Sonya Varma, and we're honored to have you here with us. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And so at this point, you're probably like, hey, Sonya, I get it. Got to pay attention, present moment, no judge, understood. You're all kind of with me here. But I suppose I'd be lying if I said that I didn't also have an urge to highlight how challenging this can actually be for us to do on a day-to-day basis. It can be really, really tough to do even one thing with intention. And so maybe if you guys are anything like me, I'll find myself eating dinner while watching like the Great British Bake Off, while also having a conversation with my partner and like thinking about the laundry list of things that I might have to do for tomorrow. It can be like so easy to kind of go through the motions and kind of get lost in this automatic routine. And that can kind of make it really easy to just like move past the present moment rather than really taking a moment to live through it and live within it. And we aren't always equipped or programmed to actually take intentional time or space to exist in the present. So in fact, again, if you might be like me, it might be more comfortable or natural maybe, or quick to turn to this, to live in the future. Thinking or maybe sometimes worrying about everything upcoming, whether that be a test at school or a work deadline or a bill to pay or groceries to do, whatever, any number of other things might come up that we're thinking about in the future. And in a lot of ways, we're really kind of trained to think ahead. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here to say that thinking about the future is a bad thing. I don't want to confuse that. We pay attention to deadlines. We want to do that. We want to remember appointments. It's adaptive to be able to do those things. We can be accountable and successful. All those things are good. And so while we're also like really good at living in the future and it has its own benefits, many of us are also, again, maybe also like me, really good at kind of hanging out in the past. Where it's really easy to spend a lot of time reviewing past experiences. How the heck did that interview go? Or did I put my foot in my mouth at that event the other night? It's really easy to kind of reflect on the past, particularly in a way that's evaluative. And again, there's lots that we can learn from our past experiences, past achievements, past mistakes. So again, not here to tell us that attention to the past or the future are bad. They're not. They've got their benefits. But it can also be really, really easy to kind of get pushed out of balance a little bit. And we can be really, really consumed by our worries sometimes, or feeling really, really negatively about something that maybe has happened in the past. That might start to feel really overwhelming. Might feel really sad. And that kind of can sometimes make it really difficult to let go of those things. And in general, my hunch, at least for myself and maybe some others, is that most of us aren't really as comfortable existing in the present as we could be, or perhaps that maybe we should be. given that being present in the moment has a lot of benefits on its own. And so this is really where mindfulness kind of comes in, as that practice of purposely placing your attention on the present moment. And not only just doing that, but doing so in this kind of non-evaluative way, kind of like taking the time to soak everything in, kind of like a sponge. But I don't know. I can tend to be a little bit skeptical. Maybe you're also feeling a little bit skeptical or kind of wondering, like, what gives? Why does it matter how much I'm paying attention to the present moment? It's not really going to help me solve the problem that I have tomorrow that I've got to deal with. And okay, fair enough. And while I can't say whether mindfulness will help solve those problems directly or not, what I am here to be able to tell you is that mindfulness has all sorts of benefits. But first, maybe we can think about what are some of the consequences that might come with not being mindful. Or I say mindful, or just kind of means paying attention to the present moment. A lack of this can sometimes lead to struggles with rumination. So kind of thinking about something again and again and again. It can make it a lot more difficult to stop yourself from fixating on the past or the future. It can also become, without mindfulness, it can kind of become difficult or maybe even impossible sometimes to focus and concentrate on a task in the present, no matter how important that task might be, especially when we're in a situation where we have no choice but to engage in that circumstance that's maybe really difficult or really painful. So maybe there's like a really stressful work meeting or going to a social event if kind of being around a lot of other people can be difficult for you. So for those who may be struggling with those kinds of things, maybe struggling with emotion dysregulation or behavioral dysregulation, an absence of mindfulness might make it more likely for that individual to engage in some impulsive behaviors or life-threatening behaviors. And when I say life-threatening behaviors, I kind of mean things like suicidal or non-suicidal self-injury, things that are really harmful to ourselves. So where does mindfulness come in to help with some of that? Like, how does it happen? Well, in general, increased mindfulness practice can make it easier to enjoy the good things in life as they occur. It can help us to be fully engaged in whatever it is that we're doing. It may also allow us to have a wider capacity for dealing with challenges, dealing with adversity or tough situations. By focusing on the present moment, it can become more difficult for your mind to wander and get caught up or fixated in the future worries and the past regret or kind of reflection on the past. Mindfulness training in DBT also helps individuals, and particularly those with borderline personality disorder, in four kind of distinct but overlapping ways. So it first can really help individuals learn to go inwards, increasing awareness of both oneself and their own private internal experiences, as well as others. Second, it also allows you to increase attentional control over your mind. So instead of letting your mind control you with wandering thoughts, it kind of helps you to block that process. Mindfulness can also increase your ability to focus and to pay attention. And it's actually that very increase in awareness and attention that can lead to a third way in which mindfulness can be really helpful. And this is a big one. So it can help individuals in the moment when they're feeling really intense, maybe negative emotion, to engage in more effective behaviors. So with some mindfulness practice, you might be able to kind of notice and help to interrupt or thwart engagement in some of those dangerous, impulsive, or life-threatening behaviors. And it might help you to create the space to alternatively practice really adaptive or positive behaviors. And relatedly, there's also work that suggests that increased mindfulness doesn't only help you to engage in the good things and do these really adaptive things, but it's also associated with activation of brain regions in your mind that are associated with more positive emotions. So it's actually maybe helping you to feel and experience the positives more easily too in that way. And there are likely countless ways that mindfulness may be beneficial, but one final way here that I just want to highlight is that mindfulness can help to increase self-validation, which is particularly important for those who have BPD. And we could have certainly a whole webinar just kind of talking about that idea. But what I will say here just briefly is that one of the functions of mindfulness in DBT is explicitly to target self-invalidation for those who experience this disorder. And as I'll talk about a bit more shortly, mindfulness kind of teaches clients, or we hope that it might teach clients to approach emotions and experiences with a non-judgmental and accepting stance. And so as people might continue to try to practice this mindfulness thing, they learn how to apply these skills to thoughts and feelings that they may have learned throughout past experiences to invalidate kind of automatically. So mindfulness in this way can kind of help to interrupt the cycle of really intense, painful emotion and kind of the paradoxical effects of invalidating that emotion. But I think that's enough about that for now. So that's just a bit about how mindfulness is particularly relevant in general and in BPD. But I also just want to highlight that there's lots of work that really speaks to the benefits of regular mindfulness practice in general. So you can see lots of things on the screen here. Increased mindfulness practice, regular practice has been associated with increased emotion regulation effectiveness. That helps to decrease, as I was talking about, those distractive and ruminative thoughts and behaviors. It's associated with decreases in depression, anxiety, anger, emotional irritability, and lots of other things. So I wish we could spend all of our time just talking about all the benefits, but I will leave it at that. There is just one more thing that I want to share about this, though. And while those are some of the benefits and ways in which mindfulness may be working, I just wanted to briefly talk about one more of the whys for why this mindfulness thing is working so beautifully to elicit all of these benefits. And again, there are probably many different mechanisms by which mindfulness works and is effective, and many downstream benefits of mindfulness practice, probably endless. But one explanation that I just wanted to share with all of you that has meaning, both for mindfulness and maybe also a bit more broadly, is an idea that's discussed by Dr. Marsha Linehan and many others, that being present to our lives is the opposite of avoiding our lives. So being present is the opposite of trying to avoid or suppress our experiences. That's really important. There's a lot of research that shows that suppression, or in other words, just trying to shut down and not feel, not experience what's happening to you in the present moment. It could look like maybe trying to really just shut off that really intense sadness that you might be feeling, or really intense anger. There's research that shows that kind of doing that and shutting those feelings down actually inadvertently increases the frequency of which those very thoughts and emotions that you're trying to suppress occur. Avoidance of negative emotion or experiences that may cause you to feel poorly, in the short run can make a lot of sense. In the short run, it kind of makes sense that it solves the problem, like shutting down emotion kind of solves the problem of not wanting to experience that negative emotion. And sometimes we might need that. So for example, turning attention away from negative emotion with something like distraction, can be really important. For example, if you're super nervous for an interview, it might make sense to distract yourself in that moment. You might want to listen to a happy song, or might want to call a friend and talk to a friend to kind of help ease those painful emotions in the situation, especially if you have to do the situation. However, this doesn't really offer as many permanent changes or benefits to us in the long run. So when we avoid or we suppress emotion, it can sometimes kind of teach us that we aren't actually able to tolerate those painful experiences. And by shutting them down immediately or trying to escape painful emotions, those emotions or the experiences that kind of elicit them, it'll actually only continue to make those emotions feel more painful in the future. And in fact, avoidance of our lives and of negative emotions in general can often cause more problems and rarely solve problems. So all this to say, mindfulness is just one way in which we can really practice living an approach-based lifestyle. And by kind of turning our attention towards these painful experiences in the present, what happens is that we can kind of start to teach ourselves and learn new information that even if it's so tough, we can actually tolerate those really intense, painful things, and can help get us through those painful moments. So that's just a little or maybe a big plug for the importance of living an approach-based lifestyle. And I swear, I promise now, I will hop off of my soapbox and we will continue along. Switching gears just a bit, I just want to highlight that while we're talking today about mindfulness within DBT, DBT isn't the only treatment to kind of recognize this concept. Mindfulness, as I kind of said, is everywhere. As a practice, it's become really, really widespread. You may notice courses in mindfulness being taught within business or kind of corporate life. It's taught in medical schools. Of course, it's really common to yoga. And for those yogis out there, this probably feels like super familiar. It's also just kind of, mindfulness is also commonly talked about as like a general self-care practice, not to mention being relevant and talked about in so many other settings. So beyond that, it's also now been integrated into lots of different types of interventions or treatments. And I know I have a whole heck of a lot of letters up here on this screen right now, and it's a bit like acronym city. But really this whole slide is just to mention that there's a lot of other mindfulness-based interventions out there. And these are just some that kind of come to mind. So we've got mindfulness-based stress reductions, MBSR. We've got mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT. We've got present-centered therapy for PTSD, as well as acceptance and commitment therapy, among others. There's lots. It's very common. So that's all I'll say about that. And without further ado, we'll start talking about mindfulness in DBT, more specifically. So inherent in understanding how mindfulness kind of ended up in DBT, I think one of the first steps is just kind of talking a little bit more about mindfulness in relation to the population for which DBT was designed. So for those who have attended previous webinars, you may already be really familiar with what BPD is, or maybe you've just kind of heard of this in your life in some other way, or have had some other experience that has kind of given you some exposure or understanding to what this is. For those of you who are not, I just thought I'd give a really, really brief summary that in general, we understand BPD as a disorder that's characterized by emotion dysregulation and interpersonal relationship challenges. BPD can also involve difficulties or instability in cognitions and emotions, so thoughts and emotions, behaviors, as well as identity. So I won't chat too much more about what BPD is, but what I will mention is that research suggests that having reduced mindfulness skills is commonly recognized in this disorder. Other work also suggests that deficits in mindfulness may be linked to emotion dysregulation, may be linked to difficulties in interpersonal relationships, linked to increases in rumination, as we were kind of talking about. And it's also kind of linked to harmful or those life-threatening behaviors. A lot of those can kind of be characteristic of BPD. And one thing that I also just kind of want to highlight, and that I've already kind of talked around and just feel pulled to stay with for another moment here, is that we really understand BPD as a disorder that involves intense and painful emotions. And some treatments or interventions might get people a bit like kind of locked up in a struggle that involves trying to push emotion away or to ignore it or to get rid of it. But actually, one of the ways in DBT that we can help people to tolerate these really intense emotions and allow them to survive is that by acknowledging that emotion can actually kind of help people get out of this struggle with the push to make emotion just disappear, whereby kind of acknowledging that emotion, allowing it to have some space and feel real, can be really freeing and validating of their own experiences. So that's a bit about BPD and mindfulness. And given this, and perhaps like unsurprisingly at this point in the presentation, as DBT was developed, mindfulness was really central to the design. So I thought it may be fun for us just to take a brief jaunt down memory lane, super briefly, as to how DBT, very generally speaking, kind of came to be. So when Dr. Linehan was developing this treatment, she was doing so as something to help people who were experiencing really, really heightened emotional sensitivity, as well as severe emotional and behavioral dysregulation, and who were also struggling with thoughts of suicide and suicidal behaviors. So again, many of these kind of comment what we see in BPD sometimes. And so with a goal in mind of figuring out how can we best support and help these individuals struggling with these really tough things, she tried a few things as she developed the intervention. So at the time, there was a really big focus on behavioral treatments that focused on changing behaviors. So of course, understandably, that's where she began. However, she learned that too much of a focus, kind of like a singular focus, just on changing behaviors. So for example, maybe a therapist would be doing everything in their power to try to stop somebody from engaging in risky behavior. That kind of focus was inherently invalidating for individuals, just focusing to change. And so she actually found that it increased distress for those people. So not effective, change paths. So she did change tactics and explored the opposite pole. And she found that doing the exact opposite, being exclusively accepting and validating, also wasn't enough. That wasn't enough to really stop these threatening behaviors, life-threatening behaviors associated with BPD. And so that left her in a bit of an interesting position where she realized that instead a balance was necessary, a balance between accepting an acceptance of an individual where they are, while also still trying to push them for change was the optimal plan. So kind of a marriage of the two of those things. And so in search of practices that were already available and effective, she drew on Zen Buddhism and mindfulness principles there, which kind of came to be translated into some of the core mindfulness skills that we'll be talking about shortly. And it's not just some mindfulness skills. Mindfulness ends up having this really big and central role in DBT. And as some of you may recall from Dr. Yuli Isaac's webinar recently, DBT involves 4 modules, and I won't talk too much about what it looks like, but the treatment itself is designed such that mindfulness skills, the core skills, are taught and revisited throughout the duration of the treatment. And therefore, there's extensive exposure to this mindfulness stuff. So we really can't get away from how central it is to the intervention itself. And it's actually also just wanted to share that it's not just central to those kind of on the receiving end of DBT, but it's also really embedded within the treatment for the therapists too. So DBT, as part of its design, involves something called a consultation team meeting, where all of the therapists kind of meet weekly. And they're meeting to help seek support from each other and also support each other in how they can best provide help to their clients. But often at the start of this meeting, therapists might start with a brief mindfulness practice. So it's not just that it's important to the clients, but that's really recognized as like living this mindfulness-based, present-focused lifestyle is really valuable and to everyone. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that. And as one final note, we often think about mindfulness as like a precursor or like a prerequisite to other DBT skills as well, and to other skills in general. Part of that is because it can be really, really hard to change something if you're not actually aware of what that thing is in the moment. And so mindfulness is this thing that kind of comes in and allows you to kind of adopt and have that awareness to help figure out what it is that we're trying to change. So for those of you at this point who are kind of feeling like, all right, Sonya, I'm in, I'm hooked, I buy it. Now, like, what does it look like? What's this thing? I know we got an intro in the beginning, but what is it? So I just wanted to give you some examples of mindfulness as it's taught in DBT, just so you can kind of start to understand how these skills might show up in practice. However, I do just want to emphasize, I kind of talked about this at the beginning as well, but the framing of this is totally educational. And so the function is really just to highlight some of the key information and not by any means kind of provide an exhaustive list of what these skills are, despite how amazing they are. It's really just to kind of allow us to dabble a little bit in what these look like and share about a handful of different skills and kind of what those look like in practice. So that's the only caveat that I wanted to mention. So in DBT, there's lots of different mindfulness skills beyond just what we're going to talk about today. But what we will talk about today are some of what DBT recognizes and calls the core mindfulness skills. So the what and the how skills. It's not all of the core mindfulness skills, but it's some of them. Which overall kind of just teach people how to observe and experience the present moment or reality as it is, to reduce judgments and live in the moment effectively. So these skills teach people, or are hoping to teach people, to kind of notice what's going on within themselves, what their private experiences are, as well as that of what might be going on around them in their outside world, all the while becoming and kind of remaining centered. So if you're interested in learning more about mindfulness in general and in DBT, and learning kind of how to practice these skills for your own personal use, I'll direct you to a slide that I have at the end of this webinar that has just some information about some resources and places that you could turn to if you're interested in learning a bit more in that way. So what we will do for now is just start off talking about the what skills. So these what skills kind of give a step-by-step about what you're doing when you're trying to practice being mindful. And in DBT, these are the three components of those what skills. So we've got observing, describing, and participating. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about all of those. The first what skill is observing. So when we talk about wanting to observe, this refers to specifically kind of encouraging people to pay attention to events, emotions they may experience in response to those events, and other behavioral responses. So with observing, the goal is really to stay with the moment, stay with that present moment with awareness, rather than leaving a situation or trying to put an end to the emotions if they're painful. And it's also not necessarily trying to make them stick around for longer, even if you're noticing that they're really nice or positive emotions. Observing is also not about making interpretations of what it is that we're noticing. You know, we aren't making judgments about the fact that I should or I shouldn't be distracted right now. It's really just noticing, I'm distracted right now. And that's kind of it. We let it pass. So observing kind of looks like noticing your bodily sensations or kind of using your body to sense what's going on, what you might be feeling. This could be like, what am I seeing? What's coming through my eyes? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? You know, what kinds of things might I be feeling on my skin? What's taste like? Kind of all of those senses. It's also paying attention on purpose with intention to the present moment, which we've talked about lots at this point. It's also controlling your attention, but not what you're noticing. So you're keeping focused, but you're not trying to control what it is that's coming up. We're pushing away nothing and we're clinging to nothing. This can also look like practicing wordless watching. So you can watch your thoughts come into your mind and then let them slip right by again, just kind of like clouds in the sky. You just kind of notice feelings as they rise and fall naturally. And so you're observing things that are happening within you and also beyond you, kind of on the outside as well. So the second skill, the second what skill is describing. And so this can be describing events, situations, personal experiences, or emotions using your words. And so this is thought to be really important both for communicating, you know, maybe sharing with a partner or a loved one exactly how you're feeling, whether that be really, really sad, or maybe mildly irritated or just kind of feeling bummed out or something like that. It's also thought to be really important to help increase self-control. But what does that kind of look like? So describing can be something like putting words to an experience. So for example, when a feeling or a thought arises, or you do something, you acknowledge it. And you can do this by saying something in your mind like, oh, okay, anger has just enveloped me, or I feel really tense in my stomach. Or you might notice a thought. So a thought, I can't do this, just came into my mind. You can also be labeling what you observe. So giving your feelings a name, a label as a thought, just as a thought, a feeling just as a feeling, an action just as an action. Same as with observing, the goal here is to really try to detach your interpretations and opinions from those observations and descriptions. So we're describing the who, the what, the when, and the where. You know, we're just kind of observing the facts as the facts. One thing to remember here is that, you know, we kind of highlight that if you can't observe it through your senses, you can't describe it. So these skills are really kind of building on each other, where it's really important to be able to observe, notice those things, and then be able to describe it. The third mindfulness what skill is participating in present experiences completely without self-consciousness. So much easier said than done, hey? And there's just a quick but important distinction to be made here. Participating can be mindless. You know, we can probably all think of experiences that we have throughout the day when we're fully participating, but we're doing so without even thinking, without even noticing that. So a good example of this is like driving to work or to school and like by a stroke of a miracle, you kind of end up there with no memory of how you arrived. We all kind of have these experiences sometimes, but what this kind of highlights is that we can be mindful through these activities. So participating is really kind of intentionally throwing yourself into an experience without a worry or a consciousness about what or how you're doing it. And so what does that kind of look like? It does kind of look like throwing yourself completely into the activities of the current moment. You're not separating yourself from what's going on in the moment. You know, if you're playing music, you're really listening to that music. It's really like intentionally throwing yourself into the experience with no worries or consciousness about how it's going. And it's also kind of becoming one with whatever you're doing in that moment, like kind of this experience of like kind of forgetting yourself or like flow, kind of like a flow mode almost. And relatedly, this can be like going with the flow, responding with spontaneity. So that's a bit about what participating looks like. So those are the what skills. And now we're just transitioning as we kind of wrap up here to talk a little bit about the how skills. So when we talk about these, what we're trying to teach people to do is just how to really practice those what skills with these different principles in mind. So these principles mean that as you're observing, describing, and participating in the present moment, you're doing so, one, non-judgmentally, one, mindfully, and effectively. So what does that kind of look like? So taking a non-judgmental stance basically just means that you're not evaluating things. It's a non-evaluative approach, which again, we've kind of been talking about. This is like not judging something as good or bad. And again, yeah, really not news at this point in the presentation. We want to detach the thoughts and observations from judgment. And I suppose just another clarification here is that this skill doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to take a negative interpretation and make it into a positive one. The idea here is really that we're kind of trying to teach people or raise awareness to the fact that it's not about becoming more balanced in the way you evaluate or judge something. But in this case, we're really trying, when we're trying to get people to kind of practice mindfulness, judging should kind of be dropped altogether. And the second principle, that is of the how skills, teaches people about this idea of paying attention one mindfully. So what's that all about? This is just kind of encouraging people to focus one's mind and awareness in the current moment's activity or experience. So just on one thing at a time, rather than dividing attention across many, many, many different things. And so like I was kind of talking about earlier in this presentation, it's like so easy to be doing a million things, like hoping the dog doesn't snag something or do something wrong at home, or making a snack, listening to a podcast. We're like always kind of doing lots of different things. The idea here is that practicing the what skills, one mindfully, hopes to teach people that achieving such a focus requires control of attention, and it encourages people to also participate in the present, doing one single thing at a time and engaging in it with alertness, awareness, and wakefulness. So there's one final skill that we'll chat about today, and this is what's called doing those what skills effectively. And so this skill is supposed to kind of help push against that tendency that a lot of us might have in the moment to sometimes be focused or maybe a bit stuck with having to be right or having to have things go fairly, rather than being able to actually take a step back and do what might be needed or called for in a particular situation. So when we talk about this effectively skill in DBT, the idiom of cutting off your nose to spite your face kind of resonates here. Practicing effectively is really doing what's needed in a particular situation, and trying your best to let go of just the kind of need for something to be fair or just in that moment that might be associated with it, rightfully so. And sometimes people can maybe find it a bit easier to give up being right in that moment for being effective when it's kind of viewed more as like something that's really helpful, rather than kind of seeing it as something that's just kind of giving in. So put simply, this skill is doing what works in the moment. So as we come really, really close to the end here, the one thing that I want to leave you guys with is this idea of practice. So one thing that Marsha Linehan highlights is that no matter what, these skills are super, super helpful, and that's great. And it can take some time for them to feel really, really, really strong. Like the more you continue to practice something, you know, it's really similar to like riding a bike or working out. Like you notice that your muscles might get stronger and things just feel easier over time, so that you're kind of like sharpening that tool set for the moments when you really, really need it. So the more that you practice mindfulness, the more it'll be accessible to you in moments when you need it. So if this sounds like if it's of interest, practice is an important part of that, important part of making it accessible. Okay, as I promised earlier, I just wanted to direct us to this resources page as well. There's a bunch of different things on here, so I won't go through it explicitly, but there's some self-help books that you might find interesting, and maybe not. But there's also some information about BPD and OHIP covered and sliding scale referrals in Toronto. There's some crisis lines for those who may be needing that kind of support. There's also some information for general counseling services, some psych referrals here in Toronto, and general mindfulness resources. And so I apologize to those of you who may be joining from elsewhere. This is a lot of Toronto-centered information. But yeah, if you want any more information, I've included the link below, a link that has some contact information for some of these things and a few more resources as well. I also just wanted to say thank you to this wonderful foundation for hosting me today. And thank you to all of you out there who have been listening and taken this time to sit with me and learn a little bit about mindfulness. I really am grateful to be here. And so with that, I will pivot back to our team and we can see how many questions you might be able to get through.
Thank you, Sonya. Thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. I'm just going to do some maneuvering here and transfer you guys over to this side of the screen. Okay.
Okay, so we do have a few questions here for you, and I'm going to pass it over to Lucia, and we're going to go through these questions. And if anyone has any questions, yes, please feel free to chat it, post it in the Q&A box there, and we'll get to your questions.
Hi, how am I coming across? Can you hear me, Sonya?
I sure can. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, great. So before I get into the Q&A box, we got a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one is, hi, I'm currently enrolled in DBT in a psychosocial rehabilitation program for people with mental illness. However, I also have comorbid disorders, including autism type 2, cognitive delay, and ADHD. Do you have any recommendations for someone who has a hard time sitting still and a hard time processing sound? They're more a visual learner. How do you modify mindfulness for everyone?
I mean, that is just such a wonderful question. I appreciate you for asking that. It's really hard, and I might say this again for other questions too, but it's really hard for me to kind of speak to what's specifically helpful for any one person's kind of situation without knowing kind of a bit about the background. And so what I might not necessarily recommend, but what might be helpful is kind of thinking through where these skills might, like what kind of resonates of some of these skills and some of the other skills, and kind of taking and practicing what feels appropriate, and hopefully maybe with the help of a healthcare provider that you might be working with as well. It's really tough to say exactly what, and I wish I had like a back pocket of things that I could be like, oh, this is the thing to do. I so wish I did. But yeah, it's tough for me to know exactly what might be helpful in that case. Yeah.
Fair. Okay, so we did receive a question in the chat, and I think it was answered, but just in case anybody else has a similar question or would like to hear a little more or missed it in your presentation, they asked, what is DBT, Dialectical Behaviour Therapy? If you could maybe provide like a little summary.
I would love to. This just like makes me very happy and brings me a lot of joy. So I think I can also direct people back to, it might have been Dr. Yuli Isaac's webinar that maybe is still recorded. I know Trisha can probably confirm or deny whether it's still available for people who are interested in learning a lot more. But in sum, Dialectical behavior therapy is a psychotherapy treatment for those who have borderline personality disorder, but it's also been adapted and used for a lot of other populations too at this time. It's still kind of being tested, but people who, like, there's some work that's been done on DBT and eating disorders and substance use. So it's, you know, as much as I've been kind of talking about today, DBT for those who have borderline personality disorder, it can be used for other populations too. What is it exactly? So the way that it was kind of designed in standard DBT is that DBT kind of involves a few different things. So one of those things is individual therapy, which happens weekly for about an hour with a therapist. And there you're kind of talking one-on-one with someone about what's been happening throughout the week. It's way more than just that, but I'll leave it at there's one-on-one individual therapy. There's also a skills training component that comes in a group setting. So there's group that's added to that, where you're learning a lot of these skills. So you might be learning the mindfulness skills that we've kind of talked about today, other mindfulness skills. There's also interpersonal effectiveness skills, stress tolerance skills, as well as emotion regulation skills that come in those different modules that kind of was up a little bit earlier in the presentation. But yeah, so there's lots of skills that you're learning in skills group. There's another part of DBT as kind of designed as like standard, is having that consultation team that I mentioned, where therapists are meeting weekly. So that's actually a really intentional part of the design of DBT, to have this support for therapists. And they're talking, you know, both to support one another and see how they can, how they can support one another, whether they're feeling poorly or feeling good, and just kind of is kind of a bit of therapy for the therapist in some ways, but also how to support their clients. And then another component of DBT that kind of makes it fit into this like standard delivery of DBT is after hours coaching. So this can look kind of different depending on what clinic might be offering this kind of coaching, but it could look like a paging system where maybe a therapist or a group, a team member is available kind of 24 hours a day in moments when individuals might be in crisis or feeling like they need extra support. So it's used, that kind of extra offline skills coaching is really used to help bolster the effectiveness of the skills that you already have, or to coach somebody through a really, really difficult time, to help prevent engagement in really some of those life-threatening behaviors I was talking about, like suicidal or non-suicidal self-injury. So
okay.
Yeah, I'll leave some rambling. I'll leave it at that.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so next question we have in the Q&A. Any tips on developing a daily habit of mindfulness practice? And this person would like to add that you're doing a great job.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you, whoever you may be. So appreciate that. You know, I wish I had like a standard tip, but I think there's probably lots of different things that might work for different people. So what I can talk to for myself is that for me, it's really helpful to, I'm a very like, you probably could tell at the beginning of the presentation with my agenda, like I really like routine and structure. So for me personally, and again, may work for others, may not, I like just having, like, knowing that in my mind, I have dedicated like 5 to 10 minutes whenever, like maybe for me, that's in the morning if I know I have a busy day ahead, or in the evening, but just really kind of carving out the time to have that space to just practice intentionally, which kind of sounds like, maybe just sounds silly, like, oh, if I could just like make the time happen, I would. But I know for me, just kind of making that commitment to myself to carve out the space to really be able to sit and practice is what will give me the chance to actually give it a try and keep practicing ongoing. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so on to the next question. They say, I find it difficult to do mindfulness. And I think there was supposed to be a little emoji here. I'm not sure if it's important, but I think it's a little female gender symbol emoji. I just in case I don't want to offend the person who sent the question. On my own,
Yeah.
I find with a guidance voice, it helps me much better. Is there a way I can switch it off and do mindfulness alone without the voice guidance?
Yeah, you know, again, really hard to say without kind of knowing your everyone's specific situation, what might be making that more difficult. I guess like one way to kind of think about that is to see whether, you know, as we're kind of talking about practicing kind of in general, that skill of mindfulness may become easier over time. And again, I'm just kind of saying that generally. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true of you, but maybe kind of seeing how it goes over time and then changing it up to see if, you know, maybe a minute of mindfulness or 30 seconds of mindfulness, even on your own, feels accessible, and kind of building on that over time maybe is helpful. But again, that's just kind of a general thought is one thing you might be able to do.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, the next question is, I have borderline disorder and bipolar disorder. I believe what they are saying is their life is mostly in isolation, and they've accepted that it's a part of who they are, the isolation. Is this a good idea or is it wrong? In other words, I'm not ashamed of who I am.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate whoever this is for sharing, and I don't get to place any judgment whether it's good or bad, but I know that a lot of people find it really validating and comforting to kind of know and identify with something, and to know that you are part of a community and you're not alone in struggling with some of these things. So I do think that can, and my personal take is that can be really valuable, just kind of identifying and knowing that, as much as I totally hear that feeling of being alone and isolated is really, really hard. Maybe part of this is also knowing that there's a community out there too that can be helpful to kind of join with.
Okay, so the next question is, how does DBT help people tolerate intense emotions, exposure, talk therapy, or some other way?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a great question, and probably is like a series of webinars. You know, there's a lot of different ways that DBT kind of comes at this from different angles. There's lots of different skills. One of the modules in DBT is called distress tolerance. And so within that module, people are kind of taught skills that might help them in the moment really help to bring down intense emotion. And I'm like hesitant to go too much into that, but that could look like splashing really cold water on your face to kind of immediately help to bring down intense emotion. It can look like deep breathing, like really focusing on deep breathing and paced breathing. But those are like really me just kind of throwing trickling a couple of things in there. There's like so many ways that DBT as an intervention or treatment itself kind of comes at targeting intense emotion. Yeah.
Great. Next question. Can you give an example of how these skills, I believe it's referring to mindfulness, could be used in the moment to prevent self-harm particularly?
That's such a great question. And I will answer this with just a bit of a general description, and know that this is not intended to be like, this is what you should do in this moment. But I think one of the general ways in which mindfulness can help is that when you're starting to, and this is kind of the idea that noticing what you might be feeling or might be experiencing, really, really intense shame, and taking a moment to kind of sit with that and notice it and feel it and give it that validity, can create some extra time and space to that. Maybe part of what an urge to just immediately get rid of that like intolerable emotion to go away is, that can maybe in some ways feel easier to address by self-harming or doing another kind of behavior that might be harmful in another way. So I think one of the ways in which mindfulness can kind of come in is to create like a bit of a buffer in some ways. Like it kind of creates some more time for you to kind of stay present in the moment. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Could you give an example of effective mindfulness? Because this person is saying that they're finding it hard to imagine.
Yeah, hard to kind of go through that moment, like go through that process. I think, and I'm sorry, I don't mean this to be a cop-out answer at all, but I actually think what might be effective for one person might feel different for another. So, for example, for me, I might find that an effective mindfulness practice is me at the end of like 2 minutes feeling like, okay, wow, like I'm feeling refreshed. And in a moment when I'm practicing mindfulness for something different, like if I'm feeling really, really, really upset or sad, You know, an effective practice in that moment might be just giving myself space to feel that sadness and to have, and at the end, it might feel effective if I'm just feeling even like 1/1,000,000% less sad. Like something like that could be effective too. So I think effectiveness kind of looks different for different people as well.
Great. Next question. How do you deal with skeptical clients who think mindfulness is too, I love this term, airy-fairy for them?
Oh man, what a great term.
I love that.
I wish I had an answer for this. This is a great question. I do not have an answer for that. I'm sure that, you know, again, I'll go back to what I kind of said earlier. Like, it's really, really tough for me to say and to do that without knowing, you know, exactly what everyone's particular experience might be like. So it's just a little bit tough for me to answer that question. And I hear that airy fairiness. It's kind of like, okay, you want me to sit and pay attention? I get it. That's really hard. Like my thoughts race. I get it. Like that's hard. It's so tough. And yeah, it takes time. It takes time, and not sure exactly what I might say.
This person, hi Sonia, could you give an example of when someone might use an effectiveness strategy, i.e. not having to be right?
Oh, like kind of being practicing that effectively skill. Got it. Sorry, I was just taking a moment to catch up. That would be, it's kind of one of those, so those how skills kind of function together as like the principles by which you might be able to practice observing, describing, and participating. So that might come up in situations where, you know, you're noticing maybe you're talking to somebody else or the situation itself has like maybe a flavor of unfairness to it. Like you shouldn't be treated this way, or there might just be something in that moment that makes it more likely or more totally reasonable for you to kind of want to have things be a certain way when that certain way may not actually be the most effective in that moment. So that skill is kind of working in collaboration with the other principles as you're practicing mindfulness to help you know how to kind of do what's working or what's effective in that situation for that particular need, and trying in some ways to let go if there's a situation that kind of feels unfair. That's one example.
Great. And this person is asking if they can know a little bit more about your foundation.
Yeah, who am I? Who's this girl? So what more can I tell you? I am a grad student. I'm still early on in my training, so I'm in my master's degree right now at York University, and a lot of my experience comes from research settings, and now my own like coursework and research that I'm doing throughout school. And with my supervisor. But yeah, where have I come from? So I worked at the BPD clinic at CAMH for a little while. And so a lot of my experience prior to starting school was related to DBT research in general, and specifically helping to coordinate that long trial I was talking about. So lots of intervention trial work. And that's kind of continued throughout my master's as well. My supervisor does a lot of really, really cool research developing and refining interventions for those with BPD and PTSD and kind of related challenges, and is in the process of developing a couples intervention that we're testing. So I still, my foundation also involves continual practice and work in clinical trial management, stuff like that.
Great. Next question is, what were the DBT modules that you referred to? Okay, I believe that everything is in your slide, right?
Yep, in the slide for sure.
Yeah. So I believe we've had a couple of questions in the chat as well. We will be making the slide available. If you absolutely want to make sure you get the slide to your specific email, you're not sure if it's in our list of emails, you can email us at programs@abmf.charity, and we will be sure to send it to you as soon as possible. So any details like that. I believe there was also a question about the resources at the end. Those are all in the slide. And okay, so more questions. What is the difference